The widow was cast away with her infant when her husband's kin disowned her. But fate led her to a solitary rancher who would change everything. Storm clouds gathered thick as molten lead above Cedar Ridge, releasing a steady downpour that had persisted since sunrise. The sodden earth pulled at footwear and carriage wheels along the winding path to the modest cemetery. The atmosphere carried the sharp fragrance of damp juniper and freshly excavated soil. Eleanor remained motionless beside the burial site, her infant son pressed against her chest. The child moved restlessly, his warm face nestling into her moisture-dampened clothing. She adjusted her position to protect him from the gusting wind. Her attention fixed on the wooden casket being lowered into the earth. The minister's words carried steadily, but seemed distant beneath the drumming rain. A small gathering of townspeople stood with lowered heads. Across the grave, Victoria Shaw stood erect in her mourning attire, rain streaming down the black fabric, her expression set in disapproving lines. As the final handful of earth struck the coffin, Victoria approached not toward the grave, but directly to Eleanor. "Starting now," Victoria declared, her words cutting through the storm, "you hold no place in the Shaw family. Gather your belongings and depart from our property." Gasps rippled through the assembled mourners. "Mrs. Shaw," Eleanor attempted to speak, "you understood my words. My boy perished because he bound himself to tainted lineage. You brought misfortune, and now it concludes." Several nodded in agreement, while others turned their eyes away. "You would cast me away with an infant child." "Indeed I would," Victoria replied icily. "Your blood will contaminate my household no further." The ranch foreman approached through the rain, depositing a weathered chest and small bundle at Eleanor's feet, contents scattering into the mud. "Is this all you contributed to this family?" Victoria asked. Eleanor knelt to recover a child's blanket, clutching her son more tightly. She felt every stare, the minister's wife's sympathy. The ranch workers' narrowed glances, the blank expressions of those eager for the scene to end. Someone whispered regrettable, "But that heritage never finds peace." Eleanor straightened, maintaining her dignity despite the rain in her hair. She offered Victoria no further words. Turning toward the road, she carried the baby and damp bundle away. The muddy trail from the church stretched endlessly, each step labored. At the town's edge, the rainfall lightened to a fine mist, but her dress remained cold against her skin. She paused in the street, uncertain whether to travel east toward the plains or west into the mountains. Her son whimpered softly. She kissed his forehead, feeling his warmth against her chilled skin. Hoofbeats interrupted the silence, low, rhythmic, drawing nearer. A solitary rider materialized from the gray distance, his chestnut horse navigating confidently through the slippery mud. As he approached, Eleanor observed the weathered face beneath a trail-worn hat, eyes steady and evaluating. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, pulling up his reins. His voice carried depth, bearing the weight of someone familiar with harsh realities. "I learned about William." She nodded once. "It appears everyone has." His gaze briefly shifted to the baby before meeting her eyes. Again, "Where do you intend to go?" "I'm uncertain." The words emerged raw. He remained silent for a moment, rain pattering on his hat brim, then dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. "I'm Jacob Stone. Rode alongside William on more than one occasion. He was an honorable man." She studied him cautiously. His eyes moved to the chest at her feet, then returned to hers. "Appears you could use somewhere dry to wait out this weather." She tightened her grip on the child, exhaustion pressing down. Jacob stood as if he possessed unlimited time to await her response. In the quiet, the rain diminished to mist, and his horse's steady breathing filled the space between them. Eleanor still offered no answer, but for the first time since dawn, she sensed someone standing between her, and the vast emptiness stretching in all directions. The drizzle had intensified into a cold fog, weaving through Eleanor's hair and chilling the air around them. Jacob stood with one hand resting on his horse's bridle, his expression steady, unreadable, yet free from judgment. "It'll appear to have been traveling quite some time," he observed, his voice quiet but clear. "I shall manage," Eleanor responded. quickly adjusting the baby in her arms. I require no charity. Jacob's eyebrow raised slightly.
Charity?
Occurs when someone gives out of pity. This isn't that. It's too far to town in this weather, and your boy is already cold. Her chin lifted. We shall find shelter on the plains or in the mountains. His tone held no mockery, only certainty. I've seen both. They'll offer nothing but more rain and additional miles. Eleanor's lips pressed together. She had learned long ago that pity was poison disguised as kindness. Still, something in his manner of speaking, measured, like a man accustomed to weighing his words before spending them, gave her pause. Why? She asked finally. Because William would have done the same for me, Jacob said. We rode together once, fought off men who believed the law was whatever their weapons declared it to be. He protected me then. Seems only proper I protect. His family now. She regarded him for a long moment, rain whispering between them. You don't even know me. I know you're standing firm in the street when you should be seated beside a fire, said simply. When she didn't respond, Jacob reached for the chest at her feet, lifting it with one hand and securing it across his saddle. Come along, my ranch. Lies several miles west. You can decide what follows once you've warmed up. She hesitated, then followed him to the horse. His hand closed around hers, steady and sure, as he helped her into the saddle. He mounted behind her, the warmth of his coat blocking the wind as the horse moved into an easy gait toward the hills, the road blurred beneath the gray afternoon. Jacob asked nothing more, and she offered nothing. But she noticed how his hand on the reins remained relaxed, how his gaze constantly swept the land as if he had memorized every fence post and gully. Halfway to the ranch, the ache in her legs deepened, and the world began to spin. She clutched the baby tighter, but the edges of her vision softened, the mist turning to darkness. When she awakened, it was to the aroma of wood smoke and the steady crackling of a fire. She lay on a couch covered with a heavy quilt, her boots placed neatly beside it. Nearby, the sound of water simmering in a kettle filled the silence. She pushed herself up, searching for her son. Her eyes found him near the hearth, lying in a wooden cradle, its surface worn smooth by time but polished to a gentle glow. A knitted blanket was tucked around him, his tiny hands resting beside his face. Jacob knelt beside it, adjusting the cradle's position to catch the full warmth from the fire that belonged to my mother, he said without looking up. It's been stored in the back room since my sister died. Figured it was time it saw use again. Eleanor swallowed, her throat tight. She hadn't expected anything beyond a chair by the fire, perhaps a place to rest for one night. But this felt like something precious, something preserved, until... Now he rose, glancing at her briefly. Kettle's ready. Should eat before attempting to stand. Weather's turning colder tonight, she nodded, her gaze drifting back to the cradle. The firelight made the old wood glow as if it held the warmth of another lifetime. For the first time since leaving the Shaw land, she felt her son was not merely safe. He was sheltered in a place that seemed to remember how to protect what it held. The sun blazed high over Cedar Ridge, casting harsh light across the weathered storefronts and dusty Main Street. Eleanor kept her shawl pulled close, one hand protecting the small pouch of coins she'd brought for medicine. The baby's fever had broken the previous night, but she wouldn't take chances. Henderson's apothecary stood at the far end of the boardwalk, and she was halfway there when a voice, cold and unmistakable, rang across the street. Well, if it isn't the widow Shaw. Victoria's tone cut sharp as a church bell on Sunday. Eleanor slowed, turning just enough to see her former mother-in-law standing beside two of her sons-in-law. The older woman's eyes swept over her from worn boots to the satchel at her side. Why? Suppose, Victoria continued, raising her voice so the cluster of onlookers could hear, you found yourself quite comfortable living off another man's generosity, eating his food, sleeping under his roof. What's next? Taking his name too? A few murmurs stirred in the crowd. Eleanor's grip tightened on the satchel strap, but she kept her chin level.
Ow.
I'm here for medicine for my child, that is all. She is my guest, he said, his voice carrying without strain. Anyone who has a problem with her will take it up with me. And if they think they can push her out, they'll have to push me off the stone land first. Gasps and low whispers rippled. Through the crowd, Victoria's mouth thinned, her fingers tightening on her parasol. "You would risk your standing in this town for her?" Jacob's eyes didn't leave hers. "Standing's worth less than a man's word, and I gave him mine." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shuffle of boots as a few onlookers stepped back. Victoria gave a sharp sniff, turned on her heel, and stalked away, her companions trailing behind. Jacob turned slightly, glancing at Eleanor. "You still need that medicine?" She managed a small nod. He took the satchel from her hand without asking and opened the apothecary door. "Then let's get it and be on our way." Inside, the low hum of conversation from outside faded, replaced by the faint scent of dried herbs. Jacob waited while she spoke to the shopkeeper, then paid for the packet of tincture without a word. On the walk back toward the hitching post, Eleanor kept her gaze ahead. "Didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Sure I did," Jacob replied. "You're on my land. So that makes you my responsibility." She bit her lip, unsure whether to feel grateful or concerned. It wasn't just the words he'd spoken, it was the way he had said them, like he had drawn a line in the dust that no one else would dare cross. As they mounted up to ride back, she couldn't shake the thought that Jacob Stone didn't give a damn about the whispers in town. But deep down she wondered how long a man could stand against them before they tried to make him pay for it. The afternoon sun lay heavy across the Stone ranch, casting long shadows from the barn to the corral. Jacob had been mending a section of fence near the main gate when the sound of approaching hooves drew his attention. A lone rider came into view, a man in a dust-coated coat, hat pulled low. He sat easy in the saddle, but something about the way he scanned the land marked him as a man looking for more than scenery. Jacob's jaw tightened as the rider drew closer. "Pike Morrison," he said flatly when the man dismounted. Pike grinned, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long time, Stone." "Not long enough," Jacob replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "What do you want?" Pike glanced toward the house, where Eleanor's laundry fluttered on the line, then back to Jacob. "Heard you're still clinging to this patch of dirt. Some folks in town reckon it's worth more than you can get out of it. I'm not selling." Pike gave a low chuckle. "Didn't think you would, but I'm here as a favor, letting you know there are men who don't like being told no. And when men like that want something..." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Things tend to happen." Jacob's gaze hardened. "You working for them now? Guess running off in the middle of a fight wasn't the last time you sold someone out?"
Ollie.
Grin slipped from Pike's face. "Careful, Stone. I'm giving you a chance to walk away from trouble. Keep this land, and it's you, the lady, and that baby who will feel it." For a long moment neither man moved. The wind carried the creak of the barn door and the distant lowing of cattle. Then Jacob took a step forward, close enough that Pike's smirk faltered. "You can ride back and tell whoever's paying you that the answer's still no," Jacob said evenly. "And if they decide to make trouble, they'd best come ready for it." Pike studied him for another beat, then tipped his hat with a mocking flick. "Your funeral." He swung into the saddle and rode off, dust kicking up in his wake. From the porch, Eleanor had been watching. She walked down to the fence line as Jacob set the rag aside. "Who was that?" "An old mistake," Jacob said. "Looked like more than that," she pressed, her eyes searching his. He hesitated, glancing toward the road Pike had taken. "We fought together once. He left me behind when things went bad. Now he's working for men who want this place." Eleanor folded her arms. "And he thinks you'll just give it up. Men like that don't ask, they push." Jacob's voice was calm, but the tightness in his shoulders told another story. She studied him for a moment, seeing the lines at the corners of his eyes, the weight he carried without complaint. "You don't have to fight this alone," she said quietly. Jacob didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted past her to the wide stretch of pasture, the hills beyond, the land his family had worked for generations. "This land's all I've got left of them," he said finally, not letting it go. Eleanor could hear the resolve in his voice, but she also heard the echo of something else: pressure. Memory, the unspoken cost of standing his ground. When he turned toward the barn, she knew he wouldn't speak of it again that night. But she also knew that Pike Morrison's return had stirred something dangerous. Not just for the ranch, but for the man who guarded it. The morning broke cold and sharp. The kind of air that carried the scent of snow, even though the sky was still pale blue. Jacob had been watching the weather for days, knowing an early storm could trap the herd in the high pasture. "We moved them today," he told Eleanor, as he cinched the saddle on his chestnut gelding. "Before the snow blocks the pass." Samuel, one of the ranch hands, was already driving the cattle toward the narrow mountain trail that wound above Silver Creek. Eleanor stood on the porch with the baby in her arms, her brow furrowed. "That trail's narrow," she said. "If the weather turns, it's the only way to get them down fast," Jacob replied, pulling on his gloves. "I'll be back before nightfall." By the time they reached the lower slope of the pass, the wind had picked up, rattling through the scrub pine. The trail narrowed to little more than a ledge carved into the side of the hill, loose rocks skittering away into the ravine below. Eleanor had insisted on riding along, claiming she could help turn the cattle if they spooked. Jacob hadn't argued he'd learned she could be as stubborn as any rancher when she set her mind to it. Halfway up the trail, something tugged at her attention. She slowed her horse, scanning the hillside above. A section of dirt looked fresher than the rest, the rocks piled too neatly to be natural. "Jacob," she called over the bawl of the cattle. He turned in his saddle. "What is it?" She pointed up the slope. "That ridge. You see how the soil's been scraped clean in spots? And those boulders, they're balanced too close to the edge." Jacob followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. He swung down from the saddle, stepping carefully toward the slope. As he crouched, a faint metallic glint caught his frayed length of rope hidden under loose dirt, leading to a wedge holding the rocks in place. "Pike," he muttered. No sooner had the word left his mouth than a sharp crack echoed through the pass. The wedge shifted. "Move," Jacob shouted. The cattle bellowed as Eleanor wheeled her horse back, waving her arms to drive them clear. Jacob leaped into the saddle and spurred his gelding forward just as the first boulder broke free, smashing onto the trail behind them. Dust and shards of rock filled the air, the sound of stone on stone drowning out everything else. One more second, and the slide would have caught them both. Jacob coughed against the dust, turning in the saddle to see the narrow ledge littered with debris. The herd had scattered down the slope, miraculously avoiding the ravine. Eleanor's face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "You all right?" He nodded once, though his pulse still hammered. "You saw it before I did." "Only because I've seen landslides before," she said. "My father lost a wagon team that way." Jacob took in her words, the image of her quick thinking replaying in his mind. If she hadn't spoken up when she did, they regrouped the herd on the lower slope, the cattle milling uneasily. The wind was sharper now, carrying a promise of snow. Jacob gave a low whistle, setting the drive toward the valley floor. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping behind the ridgeline, turning the clouds to bruised purple. Jacob swung down from his horse and caught Eleanor's reins as she dismounted. "You saved more than the herd today," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I just noticed something was wrong." "No," he corrected, his voice firm but low. "You saw trouble and acted." That's the difference between someone who freezes and someone who rides out alive. For a long moment they stood in the chill air, the sound of the cattle settling into the corral, drifting over the yard. Jacob studied her not as someone under his protection, but as a partner who had earned her place here. "From now on," he said, "I want you riding with me when it counts." Eleanor met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Then you'd better get used to me noticing things," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Jacob's own smile was brief, but it reached his eyes. "I reckon I already am." The town hall of Cedar Ridge was packed to the rafters, thick with pipe smoke and the restless murmur of voices. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows, painting the air in gold and shadow. Every seat was filled. Men lined the walls, hats in hand, shoulders brushing the paneling. Cheers rose from the merchant's corner. Few ranchers nodded. Jacob's voice cut through. "And whose land will that track run through?" Patterson met his eyes. Your northern section. Company's offering more than fair. It's not for sale, Jacob said flatly. A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd. A rancher near the front leaned back. It's just grass and cows, Jacob. You could buy better land closer to town. That just grass is my best winter pasture, Jacob replied, rising slowly. The boards groaned under his boots. Take it, and my herd starves before spring. This isn't sentiment, it's survival. One of the younger councilmen frowned. Progress means sacrifice. My family bled for that land, Jacob said, voice hardening. My father built those fences with his own hands. My mother drove cattle through storms you wouldn't last an hour in. And you want me to sell it for a train schedule that'll change the moment Denver says so? No. The mayor leaned forward. You're one man standing in the way of this town's future. You're a room full of men willing to sell it to the highest bidder, Jacob shot back. No, I won't sign away my father's grave to strangers who've never set foot here. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Then the back door creaked open. Eleanor stepped inside, the baby in her arms. She wore no bonnet, her hair damp from drizzle, eyes steady as she crossed the room. Her boots clicked softly on the worn boards. Without hesitation, she took her place just behind Jacob. The baby stirred with a faint cry. Eleanor adjusted the blanket, lifting her chin. She didn't speak, but her presence said enough. This was her home, too. Something shifted. A few who had been leaning forward now sat back. Earlier jeers faded. Jacob didn't turn, but her nearness settled at his back like a brace. He faced the council. You wanted to see who this land matters to. You're looking at them. My name's on the deed, but it feeds more than cattle. It feeds a family. That's worth more than your money or your promises. The mayor's mouth tightened. We'll vote. Hands went up. More for the railroad than against, but not enough to pass. The motion stalled. The gavel came down with a crack. This isn't over, Patterson. Warned. I know, Jacob said, placing his hat on his head. Neither am I. He stepped aside for Eleanor, the baby now sleeping on her shoulder. They walked the length of the hall under a dozen quiet gazes. Only after the door closed did the murmurs rise again. Outside, the boardwalk glistened with rain. The wind carried the scent of wet cedar and far-off thunder. Jacob glanced at her. You didn't have to come. I know, she said softly, meeting his eyes, but I wasn't about to let you stand alone. Something in his chest eased. He tipped his hat, and together they turned toward home, knowing the fight was far from over. The main street of Cedar Ridge glowed under strings of lanterns, their lights swaying gently in the cool autumn breeze. The smell of roasted corn, cinnamon apples, and fresh hay hung in the air. Children darted between booths, clutching candied apples. While the brass band played a lively reel near the gazebo, Eleanor stood near the edge of the crowd, Thomas in her arms, watching the bustle with quiet caution. She could feel the weight of the glances that swept her way, not the sharp, cutting ones from months ago, but curious, waiting. They were all here for the harvest festival, yet she knew half the town was also here to see what Jacob Stone might do next. Jacob had kept to himself most of the evening, speaking politely with a few neighbors, tipping his hat to the shopkeepers. But as the band finished its song, he began making his way to the small wooden platform beside the gazebo. A hush spread through the crowd, conversations tapering off. Even the fiddler lowered his bow. He climbed the steps with easy confidence. His broad frame, framed by the lantern light. Removing his hat, he let his eyes sweep across the townsfolk, pausing only briefly when they found Eleanor. Evening, folks, he began, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the square. You all know me, know my land, my cattle, and the name on my deed. But there's something you might not know, or maybe you've been trying not to see. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Jacob reached into his vest and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. He held it up, the seal catching the lantern glow. This, he said, is the deed to the Stone Ranch. I've made some changes to it. He turned toward Eleanor, his voice steady and sure. Eleanor Shaw, you've stood on that land these past months. Not as a guest, but as someone who's worked, fought, and bled for it alongside me. You and your boy." He stepped down from the platform, closing the space between them until only a breath remained. "He's as much a stone as I am." Jacob unfolded the paper and read aloud, "Thomas Stone, rightful heir to the Stone Ranch." A deep silence settled. Eleanor's breath caught, her arms instinctively tightening around her son. Jacob's gaze never left. Hers. "This land'll be his one day, and until then, it's yours to call home.
Ow.
No one, no counsel, no company, no family will take that away from you." Somewhere in the crowd, a single pair of hands began clapping. It was slow at first, almost hesitant. Then another joined in, and another, till the applause rolled through the street like a sudden summer storm. Eleanor's eyes stung. She glanced past Jacob and saw Victoria standing rigid near the edge of the crowd, her mouth tight, her face pale beneath her black bonnet. The older woman said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was in her eyes. She understood she had lost any claim, any power over them. Jacob turned slightly, one hand resting lightly on Thomas's small back. "Cedar Ridge," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry over the applause. "Meet Thomas Stone." The cheer that followed was louder than before, full of warmth instead of doubt. Eleanor could hardly hear the music starting up again, or the shouts of the children weaving past. All she could feel was the weight of the moment, the unshakable sense that the ground beneath her feet truly belonged to her now. Jacob offered his hand. She took it without hesitation, and together they stepped forward into the lantern-lit street, the paper in his other hand marking not just a claim of land, but the beginning of a life they would build side by side. The morning sun spilled over the rolling hills, touching the stone ranch with gold that turned the grass into a sea of light. A year had passed since Jacob had stood before Cedar Ridge and declared Thomas his heir. There had been no wedding, no lace or choirs, just the quiet choice to share one roof. One life, in the yard, the scent of fresh hay mingled with the creak of the barn doors. Jacob stood in the packed dirt, his hands steady on Thomas's small arms as the boy wobbled forward. "One step at a time, little man," he murmured. Thomas tottered, nearly falling, but Jacob guided him back to balance. Eleanor watched from the porch, her heart full. She had once thought she would never see this, her son's first steps in a place that was truly theirs. Life on the ranch had settled into a steady rhythm. Eleanor tended the vegetable patch, kept the books, and sometimes rode with Jacob to check the fence lines. Townsfolk who had once whispered now greeted her with nods and smiles. A few still remembered the scandal, but it no longer mattered. The Stone name had become hers, as surely as the land itself. That afternoon, the wind shifted, bringing the scent of rain. In the workshop, Jacob bent over the old cradle, the one from storage, his mother's. He looked up briefly, figured it was time, he said. Eleanor stepped closer. On the smooth upper rail, letters were taking shape under his carving knife. Thomas Stone. The rasp of the blade filled the quiet room. Each stroke carried more than an ammet, was a promise, sealing what had been true since the day he'd taken them in. When he finished, Jacob brushed away the shavings. The letters stood deep and certain in the grain. Eleanor traced them with her fingertips. "It's perfect," she said softly. Jacob met her gaze with that same unflinching look he'd worn when telling the town Thomas was his blood. The same look he'd had in the council hall when he'd faced them down as evening settled and the sky turned burnished copper. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching Jacob lift Thomas into his arms and carry him inside. Lamplight spilled across the porch, warm against the coming dark. She thought of the road that had brought her here, the cold rain outside the Shaw house, the humiliation, the fear of not knowing where they would sleep, and of the man who had stepped down from his horse in the mud to offer her shelter with no questions asked. Her voice was low, meant only for herself. "I was cast into the street with my newborn in my arms. Now I have a home, a man who stood before the whole town and called my son his blood. Out here in the West, that is a vow stronger than any piece of paper." From inside came the soft creak of the cradle, the name Thomas Stone, rocking gently in the shadows. And Eleanor knew that whatever storms came, this would always be their place, the home they had built together. And that's how Eleanor Shaw went. From being cast out into the rain with nothing but her newborn to finding a home, a family, and a man whose word was stronger than any contract. If this story stirred something in you, there are countless more tales from the untamed frontier stories of love, won against the odds, of quiet bravery, and of bonds forged in dust and danger. Subscribe to Prairie Hearts to ride along on every journey into the heart of the American West, where bullets missed, but hearts didn't, where love refused to quit, and where the strongest bonds were forged in the crucible of the frontier. Hit that bell icon so you'll never miss the next chapter.